G'day guys, what's happening in Syria? Interesting stuff. Well, as we can see, with the sort of, there's an interim government of jihadis that have sort of taken over the place. It's sort of the whole place is a bit of a mess. I'll just share my screen, and then once we cover some points of geography, then I'll get back into giving my sort of take on the whole situation in that part of the world. As you can see, here's Syria. So we've got in the north this area here, and this area here. It's pretty much controlled by the Syrian National Army, Turkish occupation. So this is a Syrian interim government. So it's just basically a bullshit government that Erdogan set up. So it has no legitimacy under international law whatsoever. Then you've basically got the Syrian Democratic Forces, an American-occupied zone, and that's pretty much all of this sort of area. As I trace around, so it's pretty much those sort of areas that are this Kurds primarily in here. They're pretty much fighting bit of a desperate struggle there. And this part, and what Erdogan's trying to do is take over this area with his own jihadi, the Syrian National Army, which is sort of a bullshit thing that he created. He's trying to ethnically cleanse the Kurds out of this area. He's ethnically cleansed Kurds out of all these areas, this buffer zone. There were hundreds of thousands of people forced out. But it seems, in our modern world, if you're an ally of the US, you can ethnically cleanse. If you're an opponent, you can't. It's illegal. You remember the bombings of Serbia, and even though there were quite distinct populations there that had been there for thousands of years, or for a long time, centuries. So the Kurds have been part of this whole region, and Erdogan's trying to create a buffer zone from here all the way up to here. So he can connect the buffer zone with Iraq. That's his plan, pretty much, which is the sort of focus on that side. So then we've got pretty much this part here, excluding Latakia, where the Russians are located. This part up here where there's a number of different groups, a lot of Christians and all that, plus in this sort of area. And then you've basically got all this sort of area all the way down here to Damascus, back up here into this sort of area that is controlled by HTS, as they're called, or Tahrir al-Sham, and its allies, and Arab defectors from the Syrian Defence Force. So, Bashar al-Assad's military people that actually defected to this group, Syrian Transitional Government. So now we've got this other part here, other formal rebel forces. So you've got the Southern Operation Room, which is pretty much the Israelis are occupying that little bit there. So these are pretty much higher peaks and ranges. So it's pretty much the 98th Division ploughed through here. From what I hear, from what I've heard from one analyst out of Greece who's close to NATO, apparently the Israelis are withdrawing part of their force, large parts of the 98th 8th in 98th Division out of there. They've also got a bit of cooperation with some of the Druze in this area. This area sort of is a mixed bag of all sorts. You've got jihadis here, you've got Druze predominantly, you've got all sorts of different groups. And that's why they call it the Southern Operation area. There's all sorts of players in that area. Then you've got this part, which is occupied by the US and is part of the Syrian Free Army, which is the original group that the US backed. And then you've got all this part where they've actually extended and they have control of that. Currently, all these areas in here, because a lot of it's desert and all that through here is desert, it's pretty much no man's land. Part of this is desert as well. And no man's land, a lot in this desert, arid type area. There's a few cities because there's a few roads that network through here in that middle part in particular. And it's pretty much the Islamic State, sort of the remnants of the Islamic State sort of operate within this sort of area. But there are other players that are also operating. Kurds are operating along here and along here. And Islamic State people are operating in here, while the Free Syrian Army type, Syrian Free Army, I mean, are operating into this sort of area as well. So it's pretty much the country's in a mess. It's a failed state, obviously. There is, even this so-called transitional government. It'll probably be recognised for a while, and then it will, it'll descend into further civil war and all that, from what I can see. But pretty much this group will just use, rather than Tahrir al-Sham, rather than me saying that, I'll just use the acronyms, which is HTS, to make it simple so you guys can understand what I'm talking about. So HTS pretty much dominates the key population centres from Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus. This major corridor, this is the more fertile corridor close to the coast, and then you've got Latakia, which is, and Taran's, which is the key cities on the coast. This area here, because remember, this part here was given to the Turks, which was part of Syria. Antioch is about there. Okay, Antioch, the Patriarch, used to basically be in Syria historically. Okay, that was sort of a bit of a payoff by the British and French at the time to get the support of Kemal to basically provide support for them against the Arabs to control the oil fields in Mosul, as we say it in Greek. So that's another historical event post the Treaty of Lausanne, where there was another agreement, and the Turks deliberately flooded this whole area with more Turks which is what they're trying to do here, is ethnically cleanse this area and actually displace the population that was there, which is primarily Kurdish. They did something similar here which they displaced the Arabs, and they're trying to do something similar, get another bit of ethnic cleansing along here. So that's what's happening, with the full endorsement of the Democrats. We know what they're like. They'll actually support any nefarious ethnic cleansing and killing and genocide as long as it's their person. Their moral fibre is basically zero, but that shouldn't surprise anyone that knows me, what I think about them. But it's a failed state. I don't think anyone, Trump or anyone else, can actually bring it back from it's not even on life support, basically. Now, obviously, the Israelis would like to see a Kurdish state, something the Turks don't want to see. And I can see if the Israelis get their wish, that's if Trump supports them, potentially what you could have is this whole area here, okay? So this whole area to the north of the Euphrates, all this part here will end up being a Syriac Kurdish state. This part here, I suspect, will be part of, the Druze will be given some sort of autonomy or could even be given statehood here. Or this part could also be incorporated because the Golan Heights that are here are part of Israel. And the Druze that lived here, part of the Israeli military. There's many generals in the Israeli military, and the population is more willing to live under Israeli rule than any other rule, for the simple reason that they trust the Israelis will protect them. And so if they were to get independence for this, they would likely want to unite with Israel, and this territory could end up becoming Israeli territory down the track, potentially. So that's one thing. And I would suspect the Americans would probably give this to Erdogan up here to take. There would be probably for the Christians and the Alawites, they'd probably give this to them, which was what there was going to be an Alawite state here at the time of the decolonisation that happened after the First World War. There was supposed to be a sort of an Alawite state in that initial, just these countries were being carved up and all that. But it never happened. The French never did it. So there is a possibility we may see the emergence of an Alawite state where Christians and Alawites who get on with each other would end up within this state. And the rest of all this would end up in a Sunni type Arab state, or some sort of federation or whatever. So potentially you could end up with, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5, depending on what happens to this and depending what happens to this. Because that may, if that gets incorporated into Turkey, then that won't be a separate state. It'll be part of Turkey. So you'd end up with 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4 in that regard. But in the interim, there may be 5 initially, and then they get incorporated with some sort of vote like they did for this area here in the past. So where Antioch is, which is about here. So something like that may happen when it comes to Syria. That's the Mediterranean for you Americans that tend to have problems with geography. And there's Turkey up there. And that's Iraq. And so you've got Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon. Lebanon is here. This is Israel. There's a West Bank. There's a Jordan River. This is Jordan. Just letting you know, this is Iraq. And that little tip there is Saudi Arabia. Anyway, so that's pretty much what that looks like. That's how close all these are. Now, let me unshare. So, what had happened? Why did this collapse happen? People are talking about, what happened? Why? HTS didn't come out of nowhere, okay? All of a sudden, they've got a lot of guns out of nowhere. The guns were basically provided by the Americans and the Israelis. Simple as that. If you really want to know, that's what really happened as far as that goes. Now, and the Saudis provided some guns as well. Well, I think they actually paid for them and the United Arab Emirates, but more the Saudis. So how did it all happen? Well, the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, the Emiratis, they convinced Bashar al-Assad to, switch sides. We'll look after you, sort of was the operative word. Basically, they backstabbed him. They lied to him. So this happens in the Arab world. It's just one of those things. Unfortunately, this the power wasn't supposed to be given to him. Supposed to be given to his brother who died in a car accident. Maybe Mossad knocked him off. We don't know. He was as ruthless as his father. This guy was a doctor in the UK, and his missus from the UK. So he didn't have, let's say, the instincts for power. The generals, once his father passed away, the generals need to put somebody in power who could continue the dynasty. They just wanted somebody in power. So they offered it to him and he accepted it because it allowed him to come back to his homeland and they pretty much he didn't interfere with them, and they pretty much ran most of the show. Now, these generals were part of his father's network, and they were ruthless and feared. These were the guys that actually pushed back with the Russians, all these opponents. These are the guys that actually were able to really take on these. What happened was the Saudis said to, you've got to get rid of these people. These people cannot be part of the future Syria. You've got to get rid of these and replace these generals. And what he did was he pensioned them off and got rid of them and replaced a lot of these people. Many people who ended up betraying him, even though some of them were family members. That's how it happens in this part of the world. Remember, Saddam Hussein killed more of his relatives than he killed of other opponents. Why? Because they were the ones that most likely were going to knock him off. It's part of the, let's say, the Arab curse in that regard, that there's a lot of backstabbing for power amongst them. Their loyalties are weak on that front. So the closer somebody gets to power, the more they want it. See, the generals, they weren't concerned about taking power because they knew they couldn't hold on to the power themselves. So they had to have a figurehead. He was the figurehead. He was the son of the previous leader, so he was sort of the heir to the throne, so to speak. They could sell him to the people as the new heir. Somebody who was more cosmopolitan, came from the West, blah, 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 and all that, while they ruthlessly controlled the system and all that. And that's why they were quite successful and did quite well and were able to hold on to power. When he removed them, he removed his power base completely. That was his fatal mistake. So, and he was played. He was played by the West, the Saudis, the Americans, the Israelis. He was played really well. And they armed his opponents at the right moment, at a time when the Russians were withdrawing some forces back to Europe, and also the Iranians were sort of caught up with the Hezbollah, assisting Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah initially got its ass kicked when the Iranians and the Shiite militias came into Lebanon. What happened was the Israelis were forced into a truce, not because they wanted to. They wanted to eliminate Hezbollah, but they couldn't because you got the Iranians that came in and all that. So this whole strategy to support this HTS group was part of to break the back of the Iranian offensive in Lebanon. So let's knock off the government, put the jihadis in power. The Americans get to push out, get the Russians pushed out, which is what they want. And on the other side, the Israelis get rid of a government that's always opposed them, and also they eliminate the Syrian corridor to Lebanon from Iran. And that was the key thing, to knock out that. And that's what they did. So they basically armed these jihadis. Now they are our good friends, even though they slaughter a few Christians here and there. But what's a few Christians between friends? It just shows you quite clear that the Biden administration doesn't care if Christians get slaughtered. Hopefully, the Trump administration will have a different opinion on that and a different approach. We'll wait and see what happens there. But the reality is that that's what really happened. The Israelis have been going around just blowing up a whole lot of installations and all that. Even ex chemical facilities, just in case, so they don't fall into the hands of the jihadis. Now they don't know what is there, what was actually, because most of the chemical weapons were handed over to the Americans and be destroyed. But even if, let's say, even if all the chemicals were handed over, there is still a concern that some of the technology in the facilities may still be there. So they're taking out all these facilities. So you could say parts of the military industrial complex of Syria is being taken out at the moment by the Israeli Air Force. And that's to make sure that the jihadis cannot get their hands on any weapons of mass destruction or any other advanced tech. And this is why even the jihadis have lost some of their weapons as well. That's why they've gone back to the Turks. The head of MIT, the MIT, which is the MIT, which is the intelligence force of Turkey, have come to their aid recently. Actually, even the leader was driving around the head of MIT. That tells you everything. So pretty much by doing that, they've handed these people over to the Turks. And that's why I think that northern corridor, they'll eventually get that as part of a deal between supporting this jihadi sort of government and keeping it in power, propping it up, a bit like what they did was in Western Libya. Again, the same thing, propping up the government and getting benefits like oil benefits and stuff like that. So it's part of extracting benefits in that regard. So pretty much that's what's happening. That map is as of 2 days ago. So I don't suspect a lot has changed since the 18th. Today's the 20th that I'm actually doing this in the evening. It's interesting what's happening at the moment. I suspect there will be more outbreaks of another sort of civil war. I think we're going to have a bit of a lull for the time being. And then at some point, there's going to be another outbreak. At the moment, in Latakia, the Russians are sort of trying to negotiate some sort of deal to hold their bases. Don't know how that's going to play out yet. They may end up putting a lot of pressure on Erdogan to force the jihadis to provide that guarantee. It may happen, it may not, unclear. At the moment, the fleet's pulled away from Latakia, obviously, because you don't want to be in the port. You'd end up like, remember Pearl Harbor? When you're in the port and not at sea, you're a bigger target because you're stationary. So somebody with artillery can actually destroy your ship. So they had no option but to move out just in case. Now, I know they've been negotiating with the Libyan strongman in the east, General Haftar. So there may be an option there to get a placing. I think there's I think Tobruk, or in the west, in the east of Libya, is a port city. So there's a possibility they may be stationed there. Then you've basically got, it's really funny there because you'll have the Russians Navy there. Right next door, the Egyptians have built a new naval base. And right at the top, you've got the Crete, where the naval base, the Greek naval base of Masuda on the western side of Crete, but also the Sixth Fleet visits there as well, because it's one of their main ports that they station some of their vessels and come in for R&R and stuff like that. So, yeah, it'll be like a triangle. Interesting, fun and games. But anyway, So, but at the same time, there are some Greek vessels that visit the the Egyptian port as well, because they do have an agreement, Egypt and Greece. So I know when they actually opened it up, they did invite the wasn't I'm not sure whether it was the defence minister of Greece or the foreign minister at the time. I could be wrong. I just can't remember now. It's a while ago. So yeah, it's a nice little happy little close by. Everyone's close by there. It sounds like Djibouti down in the Red Sea, the bottom there, where there's a Chinese base and an American base right next to each other, and a French base. Yeah, oh, crazy times. One country that's got multiple basings for multiple countries and getting rents. So yes, geopolitics. The world that we live in can be a very strange place sometimes, even stranger than fiction. But as far as Syria goes, it is a failed state at this stage. Prior to that, yes, it was. You could say teetering on the on failed state. It wasn't complete because the West was still controlled by the government. It still was producing some GDP, some had some productive capacity. Now that has collapsed completely. So now we can definitely call it a completely failed state. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how these different groups, um, what happens with these different groups. So time will tell. But I still think that Syria will be probably end up carved up in either three or more configurations. So um, we'll see. I could be completely wrong, but the future will tell whether I was close to the mark or not. In the way it will get reconfigured. The reality is, he was played. Bashar al-Assad was played, tricked, whatever you want to call it, and backstabbed by some of his own people who who took dollars to basically switch sides, and that's exactly what they did. They switched sides. His old father's generals wouldn't have done that. So he's only got himself to blame for being played like a complete amateur. Maybe he should have left one of his generals to negotiate this sort of stuff. But, he thought that he could rely on these people to do the right thing. Yes. You know what thought did? Well, it's ended up him in Russia. Well, maybe he can one day get to Britain where his wife has siphoned off a lot of money and wealth in some British banks and some Swiss banks, I hear as well. So, yes, maybe life won't be that difficult for him. We'll see. Anyway, that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed it. See yous.